You were never built for this world, Claire. Daniel Whitmore said it gently enough that nobody at the table reacted. The orchestra continued playing near the ballroom's staircase while crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of moving glasses and polished smiles. Around them, Chicago's financial elite drifted through the ballroom of the Langford Hotel in black tuxedos and silk gowns, speaking in low voices about acquisitions, market forecasts, and winter homes in Aspen. Claire Whitmore stood beside her husband in a dark navy dress she had spent 3 weeks deciding whether she could afford. Her fingers rested lightly around the stem of a champagne glass that had already gone warm in her hand. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket before offering a small smile to the investors gathered around them. Claire always preferred quieter things, he continued smoothly. She never really understood ambition. A few people laughed softly. Not cruelly. Worse than cruelly. Politely. Claire lowered her eyes for only a second. The marble floor beneath her heels reflected the gold chandelier light like frozen water. She could feel the heat from the crowded room pressing against her skin, but her hands had gone cold hours ago. Daniel never looked at her when he said things like this anymore. He looked at everyone else. That somehow made it sharper. Across the ballroom, a server passed carrying silver trays of champagne beneath towering white floral arrangements. Somewhere near the stage, applause erupted for a venture capital executive arriving from New York. Daniel leaned slightly closer toward a group of investors as if Claire were no longer part of the conversation at all. Then, with effortless timing, he placed a hand at the lower back of a blonde woman approaching their table. "This is Vanessa Cole," he said. "She recently joined our executive expansion team." Vanessa smiled with polished confidence, her diamond earrings catching the light. Claire noticed immediately how naturally Vanessa occupied Daniel's space, how easily the room adjusted around her presence. Another investor lifted his glass toward Daniel. "Looks like Whitmore Logistics is entering a new era." Daniel smiled again. "Something like that." Claire said nothing. She only tightened her fingers around the champagne stem until the thin crystal nearly slipped from her grasp. A waiter brushed against her shoulder while moving through the crowd. The champagne spilled slightly onto her hand. The waiter apologized instantly to Daniel. Not to her. Outside the towering ballroom windows, snow had begun falling across downtown Chicago, soft white streaks drifting through the blue-black night above Michigan Avenue. Claire stared at the snowfall for a moment longer than necessary. In the reflection of the glass, she barely recognized herself standing there beside him. Elegant. Silent. Slowly disappearing. Nearly 20 minutes later, Daniel was still speaking with investors when Claire quietly stepped away from the table. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked where she was going. The farther she walked from the ballroom, the quieter the music became. Gold light faded into narrow service hallways lined with steel carts and muted kitchen noise. The heavy service door closed behind her with a metallic thud, sealing the warmth of the hotel inside. Cold air struck her immediately. Snow gathered along the alley pavement behind the hotel where black SUVs waited with engines running. Claire stood there alone beneath the pale security lights, her breath visible in the freezing air. For several seconds, she simply listened to the muffled applause still echoing faintly through the walls behind her. Then slowly, carefully, she slid off her wedding ring. The diamond caught one last reflection from the alley light before disappearing into her coat pocket. Her eyes closed briefly. Not from anger. From exhaustion. Then her phone vibrated inside her handbag. An unfamiliar Seattle number glowed across the screen. Claire stared at it while snow settled silently against the shoulders of her coat. The call continued ringing in her hand as black luxury cars pulled away one by one into the winter night. Seattle smelled different from Chicago. The air carried salt instead of smoke, rain instead of exhaust, and the city moved with a quieter rhythm that nobody seemed interested in explaining. 3 months after leaving the Langford Hotel through the service exit, Claire Whitmore stood beneath a gray morning sky waiting for the northbound train near Pioneer Square with a paper coffee cup warming her hands. Wind pushed strands of blonde hair against her coat while commuters moved around her without looking twice. That had become the strange comfort of Seattle. Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared who she used to be. Her apartment overlooked Elliott Bay from 6 floors above an aging brick building where the radiator hissed through the night and ferry horns echoed before sunrise. Most mornings began before daylight. Claire spent hours reviewing operational reports for temporary consulting contracts while rain traced slow patterns across her windows. She learned how to stretch grocery budgets again. Learned how to ignore the ache in her chest whenever Daniel's company appeared online beside headlines about expansion deals and executive success. Whitmore Logistics seemed larger now than when she had still been part of it. Or perhaps distance simply made everything look bigger. Claire rarely allowed herself to think about Chicago anymore. But some nights, while heating canned soup in her narrow kitchen, she still heard Daniel's voice with perfect clarity. "You were never built for this world." The words no longer made her cry. That frightened her more than the pain once had. One rainy Thursday evening, Claire arrived at the Bellevue Convention Center carrying a worn leather notebook and a laptop bag with a broken zipper she kept meaning to replace. The Regional Logistics Conference had offered free admission for independent consultants, and free events mattered when rent consumed most of her monthly income. Inside, the convention hall glowed with polished blue lighting, giant digital screens, and rows of executives in dark tailored suits discussing infrastructure forecasts over expensive whiskey. Claire stayed near the back of the room where unnoticed people usually belonged. On stage, executives from multiple transportation firms prepared a live demonstration projecting real-time shipping data across the West Coast. The presenter smiled confidently toward a crowd of investors seated beneath suspended silver lights. Then suddenly the entire screen went black. A low murmur moved across the ballroom. Someone near the front cursed quietly. The presentation software collapsed completely, wiping out every active projection moments before a major investor review. Technicians rushed toward the control station while executives exchanged tense looks under the growing silence. Claire watched for several seconds before setting down her coffee. She recognized the infrastructure problem almost immediately. The data routing sequence had overloaded during the live simulation. Nobody in the front seemed to notice the obvious backup conflict appearing inside the exposed system window. Claire walked carefully toward the side control station. One technician looked relieved enough to step aside without argument when she calmly asked for access. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. The ballroom remained nearly silent except for muted conversations and the sound of rain tapping softly against the massive glass walls overlooking Bellevue. Within less than 2 minutes, the projection screens flickered back to life. Shipping routes stabilized. Financial models returned. Applause spread through the room, uncertain at first, then stronger. Claire stepped back immediately, already reaching for her notebook as if she intended to disappear again before anyone noticed. That solution was not in the presentation. The voice came from behind her. Claire turned slowly. A tall man stood near the glowing screen beneath the pale conference lighting. Dark charcoal suit. Silver tie. Stillness that seemed untouched by the noise around him. Alexander Hale. Even Claire recognized him instantly. Founder of Hale Infrastructure Group. One of the youngest infrastructure executives in the country. He studied her with calm attention that revealed almost nothing. Not admiration. Not surprise. Something quieter. More precise. Claire straightened slightly beneath his gaze. The system exposed the conflict, she answered softly. It was not difficult once I saw the routing pattern. Alexander's expression barely shifted. Yet something about the silence around him felt heavier than the crowded ballroom itself. Before Claire could say anything else, another executive approached Alexander with urgent questions about the presentation recovery. The moment dissolved immediately. Claire slipped back toward the rear exit unnoticed by most of the room. Outside, rain coated the Bellevue streets in silver reflections beneath traffic lights and passing black cars. By the time she reached the train platform 40 minutes later, she realized her notebook was missing. Inside it were budget calculations, consulting notes, and the folded train tickets she had kept since leaving Chicago. Back inside the convention hall, long after most attendees had gone home, Alexander Hale stood alone near the empty chairs holding the worn leather notebook in one hand. He opened it briefly, studying the handwritten financial numbers pressed carefully into the pages beside an old Chicago train receipt. Then he closed the notebook gently and looked toward his assistant near the doorway. "Find her," he said quietly. The call from Hale Infrastructure arrived on a gray Tuesday morning while rain drifted steadily against Claire Whitmore's apartment windows overlooking Elliott Bay. She had been sitting at her small kitchen table reviewing freight projections for a temporary consulting contract when her phone vibrated beside a cold cup of coffee. For several seconds, she simply stared at the Seattle number glowing on the screen. The same number that had called her outside the Langford Hotel months earlier. Claire almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered quietly. 2 days later, she stepped into Hale Infrastructure headquarters for the first time. The building rose above downtown Seattle in steel and reflective glass, cold against the cloudy winter sky. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and cedar. Executives crossed the floor carrying leather portfolios while muted conversations echoed beneath towering ceilings washed in pale gold light. Claire felt immediately underdressed despite carefully pressing her charcoal blazer twice that morning. Around her, people moved with the calm efficiency of those accustomed to power. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. The receptionist guided her toward a private conference room overlooking the harbor where cargo ships drifted silently through fog beyond the windows. Claire set her worn leather notebook carefully onto the table. The same notebook she thought she had lost forever. Someone had placed it there before she arrived. A few minutes later, the door opened quietly. Alexander Hale entered alone. He wore a dark navy suit with no tie, the sleeves of his white shirt folded neatly once at the wrists as though he had already been working for hours. Claire stood instinctively. He acknowledged her with a slight nod before taking the seat across from her. No unnecessary introductions. No attempt to soften the atmosphere. Rain streaked slowly down the massive windows behind him while downtown Seattle disappeared beneath low gray clouds. Alexander opened a thin folder containing her consulting history and conference credentials. "I prefer people who solve problems quietly," he said at last. Claire looked at him carefully, unsure whether it was a compliment or merely observation. His tone revealed nothing. Yet she realized almost immediately that he had memorized far more about her than the brief conference interaction should have allowed. "Most people prefer visibility," she answered softly. "Visibility creates noise," Alexander replied. Silence settled between them for several seconds. Not uncomfortable. Precise. Claire became aware of the faint ticking of the clock mounted near the conference room entrance and the distant sound of ferry horns beyond the rain-covered harbor. Alexander closed the folder. "Hale Infrastructure is expanding into national freight stabilization projects. We need operational analysts capable of correcting problems before they become public." His gaze remained steady. "Your work at the conference suggested you understand systems under pressure." Claire folded her hands carefully in her lap to hide the sudden tension moving through her fingers. Nobody had spoken about her competence like that in years. Not without attaching conditions to it. "I work well under pressure," she said quietly. Alexander studied her for a moment longer, then stood. "Good," he said simply. "You start Monday." The following weeks passed in a blur of late-night meetings, executive briefings, and endless strategy reports spread across illuminated conference tables after midnight. Claire quickly learned that Hale Infrastructure operated less like a company and more like a constantly moving machine. Private elevators opened directly into executive floors. Black town cars waited beneath covered entrances long after rain-soaked streets emptied below. Entire expansion projects shifted direction based on conversations that lasted less than 5 minutes inside glass offices overlooking the city. Claire was assigned directly to Alexander's National Expansion Task Force almost immediately. Other executives noticed. She could feel it in the subtle pauses when she entered rooms. In the carefully polite smiles from senior managers who had worked there for years. Alexander rarely explained his decisions publicly, which somehow made the attention worse. Yet during meetings, he asked for her analysis before anyone else's. Sometimes he would stand silently near the digital projection screens while executives debated freight projections for 20 minutes, only to turn toward Claire afterward and ask, "What are we missing?" And somehow, every room would quiet while waiting for her answer. One Thursday night, nearly 3 weeks into the job, Claire remained alone inside the executive lounge reviewing shipment stabilization reports beneath soft amber lighting. Rain hammered against the windows overlooking downtown Seattle while most employees had already gone home hours earlier. Exhaustion finally overtook her sometime after midnight. She fell asleep with financial reports spread across the table beside her. When Claire opened her eyes again, the room was silent except for distant thunder beyond the glass. The digital wall clock read 2:37 in the morning. For a moment, she did not understand why warmth rested across her shoulders. Then she looked down. A dark wool coat had been folded carefully around her while she slept. Claire sat upright immediately. The lounge was empty. Alexander was gone. But beside her sat a fresh cup of black coffee, thin steam still rising slowly into the quiet room. By early spring, Claire Whitmore had become part of the rhythm inside Hale infrastructure in ways nobody openly discussed but everyone quietly noticed. Her reports began shaping executive decisions before meetings even started. Shipping delays disappeared faster under her systems. Regional projections stabilized. Entire expansion models moved more efficiently once her revisions reached the boardroom screens. Yet Claire still arrived before sunrise carrying the same worn leather notebook beneath her arm and left long after most office lights had gone dark across downtown Seattle. Outside the glass walls of the executive floor, rain continued falling almost every evening as if the city itself preferred silence. One Thursday afternoon, Hale Infrastructure flew to Manhattan for a high-level infrastructure negotiation involving federal transportation investors and several competing logistics firms. Claire sat near the back of the black SUV moving through rain-soaked streets while skyscraper lights reflected across the windows like blurred gold ribbons. Alexander Hale reviewed documents quietly beside her beneath the dim interior lighting. Neither of them spoke much during travel anymore. Strangely, the silence no longer felt formal. It felt familiar. Claire watched Manhattan pass outside the rain-covered glass while her fingers rested lightly against the edge of her notebook. Across from them, two executives argued softly about acquisition projections and shareholder pressure. Alexander never joined the conversation. He simply listened while turning pages slowly beside her. At one point, the SUV stopped at a red light near Fifth Avenue. Claire caught his reflection faintly in the window beside her. Calm. Controlled. Untouched by noise. She looked away first. The investor dinner that evening took place inside a private ballroom overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors while servers moved quietly through the room carrying silver trays and champagne beneath soft piano music. Claire stood beside a digital presentation wall explaining freight stabilization projections to a group of senior executives when one of the rival investors interrupted her mid-sentence. With respect, the man said smoothly, "I would prefer hearing operational projections from someone with actual executive authority." The surrounding conversation quieted immediately. Claire kept her posture still. Years ago, that kind of comment would have shattered her concentration for hours. Now she simply folded her hands lightly in front of her notes. The projections remain the same regardless of who presents them, she answered calmly. A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. The investor smiled thinly, clearly prepared to continue. Then Alexander's voice cut through the room without rising above normal conversation. "If you cannot speak respectfully to her," he said quietly, "this meeting is over." Silence settled instantly beneath the chandelier light. Even the nearby piano seemed distant for a moment. Claire looked toward him across the room. Alexander remained seated at the center of the executive table, one hand resting beside his untouched glass of bourbon. His expression revealed nothing dramatic. No anger. No performance. Yet every executive in the ballroom understood immediately that the conversation had ended. The investor cleared his throat and stepped back without another word. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward her notes to steady the sudden emotion tightening in her chest. Nobody had ever defended her like that without making her feel smaller afterward. Later that night, Manhattan rain washed silver across the windows of the black SUV carrying them back to the hotel. Traffic lights blurred through water streaks while jazz music played softly through hidden speakers. Claire sat quietly beside Alexander in the dim back seat, exhaustion finally settling visibly into her shoulders after the endless negotiations. Outside, crowds moved beneath umbrellas through glowing intersections and storefront reflections. "You do not have to carry everything alone," Alexander said softly without looking directly at her. Claire turned toward the rain-covered window before answering. "I am used to it." The words came out more honestly than she intended. Alexander remained silent beside her. Yet somehow the silence itself felt attentive. Not empty. The SUV arrived at the Langham Hotel shortly after midnight. Most executives disappeared upstairs immediately, eager for sleep before the following day's negotiations. Claire lingered alone in the marble lobby after removing her heels beneath one of the quiet seating alcoves near the grand piano. Her feet ached from 14 straight hours in heels and tension. Soft piano music drifted across the nearly empty lobby while rain pressed gently against the towering glass entrance doors. For several minutes, she sat there alone watching reflections move across polished marble floors. Then footsteps approached quietly beside her. Claire looked up. Alexander stood there holding 2 paper coffee cups in one hand. No security detail. No assistance. He handed one to her without speaking and sat beside her beneath the warm amber light of the empty lobby. Steam curled slowly upward between them while the pianist continued playing somewhere across the marble hall. Neither moved to leave. Neither seemed in a hurry to break the silence. And for the first time in longer than Claire could remember, the loneliness inside her chest felt slightly quieter. Summer arrived slowly in Seattle, softening the edges of the city with pale gold sunsets that lingered past 9 o'clock and reflections that stretched endlessly across Elliott Bay. Inside Hale Infrastructure, however, the pace only intensified. Entire divisions expanded across the West Coast while acquisition teams moved through airports and executive towers almost weekly. Claire Whitmore no longer felt like a temporary figure moving carefully through someone else's world. Without noticing exactly when it happened, people had started waiting for her before major meetings began. Analysts adjusted presentations after hearing her feedback. Senior executives stopped questioning why Alexander Hale trusted her judgment. Instead, they quietly watched her the way people watched approaching weather. One Monday morning, sunlight spilled across the glass walls of the San Francisco Executive Conference floor while investors gathered around a 30-foot digital projection displaying national freight stabilization forecasts. Claire stood near the far end of the table reviewing final revisions on her tablet as conversations moved quietly around her. Outside the windows, the bay shimmered beneath a cloudless sky while helicopters drifted above the financial district skyline. Across the room, Alexander reviewed acquisition summaries with 2 board members in low voices. He looked exhausted beneath the calm precision he always carried. The company's rapid growth had begun attracting political attention, media scrutiny, and pressure from competing firms across the country. Yet somehow, he still noticed everything happening inside a room before anyone else did. Halfway through the meeting, one of the board members challenged the company's latest expansion strategy with visible frustration. "The projections are too aggressive," the man said sharply. "We are moving faster than the infrastructure can support." Several executives exchanged tense glances. Claire remained focused on the financial reports in front of her, expecting Alexander to answer personally as he usually did during investor resistance. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked toward her across the polished conference table. "I trust her judgment more than mine," he said calmly. The room went completely still. Claire looked up immediately. Alexander had never spoken about her publicly like that before. Not in front of senior leadership. Not with that level of certainty. One of the executives lowered his pen slowly onto the table while another shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Nobody argued afterward. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had changed permanently. Claire could feel it in the way conversations paused slightly when she entered rooms later that afternoon. Respect inside powerful companies rarely arrived loudly. Most of the time, it arrived through silence. Over the following weeks, financial media began calling Hale Infrastructure one of the fastest-growing logistics firms in the country. Magazine covers featured Alexander beneath headlines about visionary leadership and infrastructure expansion. Investors praised his ability to stabilize failing transportation systems across multiple states. Yet internally, people knew something the media did not. Claire Whitmore had become the operational spine holding the company together. Quietly. Invisibly. Almost every successful system carried traces of her thinking now. Meanwhile, nearly 2,000 miles away in Chicago, Whitmore Logistics began appearing in entirely different headlines. Declining freight contracts. Failed merger negotiations. Internal restructuring. Claire noticed the reports accidentally one evening while reviewing market updates in her apartment. Daniel's company stock had fallen nearly 40% in 6 months. She stared at the article for several moments before closing the screen without finishing it. Surprisingly, the news brought no satisfaction. Only distance. A few nights later, Hale Infrastructure hosted a rooftop charity event overlooking the San Francisco Bay to celebrate a major transportation partnership. Strings of golden lights reflected across polished glass tables while orchestral music drifted softly through the warm coastal air. Wealthy donors and executives moved through the crowd holding champagne beneath the fading sunset. Claire stood near the rooftop edge in a deep emerald gown that caught the evening light whenever she moved. Winds swept gently across the terrace overlooking the water while camera flashes flickered near the main reception area. For the first time in years, she no longer felt invisible in rooms like this. She felt composed. Steady. Like someone who belonged inside her own life again. Across the terrace, Alexander finished speaking with several political donors before his attention shifted toward her almost instinctively. Claire looked away first, pretending to study the skyline beyond the bay. She did not notice the strong gust of wind catching the side of her dress until she nearly lost balance beside the stone railing. Before she could steady herself, a warm hand settled lightly against the center of her back. Alexander. His touch lasted only a moment. Enough to steady her completely. Yet neither of them stepped away immediately. Around them, photographers near the donor reception suddenly noticed the scene unfolding beneath the golden rooftop lights. Camera flashes burst sharply through the evening air. Claire turned slightly toward him, startled by the attention. Alexander remained calm, his hand still resting lightly against her back for 1 second longer than necessary before finally lowering it. But the silence between them had already changed. And somewhere beyond the music, beyond the city lights and camera flashes, Claire felt the dangerous beginning of something neither of them had fully named yet. The photographs from the San Francisco rooftop gala spread across financial media faster than either Claire Whitmore or Alexander Hale expected. By Monday morning, industry blogs were already analyzing Hale Infrastructure's growing political influence while investors circulated images of Alexander standing beside Claire beneath strings of golden lights overlooking the bay. Most articles focused on the company's aggressive national expansion. But internally, people noticed something else entirely. The way Alexander looked at her. Quietly. Directly. Like the rest of the room no longer mattered when she entered it. Claire tried pretending the attention did not affect her. She arrived early every morning, kept her focus buried inside operational reports, and avoided reading comments attached to online coverage. Yet whispers followed her now through executive hallways lined with glass offices and polished stone floors. Assistants stopped conversations when she passed. Board members watched her more carefully during meetings. Somewhere along the line, she had become emotionally dangerous inside a company built on control. Late one evening, Seattle rain rolled heavily against the windows of the executive floor while the city below disappeared beneath silver reflections and blurred headlights. Most employees had already gone home hours earlier. Claire remained inside the main conference room reviewing freight integration forecasts projected across a 30-foot digital wall. Her heels rested beside her chair while handwritten notes covered the polished table around her. The exhaustion behind her eyes had become harder to hide lately. Not because of the workload. Because Alexander had begun feeling less like her employer and more like the only place in her life where she no longer needed to brace herself emotionally. The realization frightened her more than she wanted to admit. The conference room doors opened quietly behind her. Alexander entered carrying a thin stack of acquisition files beneath one arm. His charcoal overcoat still carried traces of rain across the shoulders. He looked tired too. The kind of exhaustion powerful people rarely allowed others to notice. Claire immediately straightened in her seat and reached for her shoes. "You are still here," he said calmly. "So are you," she answered. For a moment neither moved. Rain tapped softly against the glass walls surrounding the room while downtown Seattle glowed faintly through the storm outside. Alexander placed the acquisition files onto the table and studied her silently. There was something heavier in his expression tonight. More cautious. Finally he spoke. "You are becoming emotionally difficult to protect." Claire looked up immediately, the words landing harder than she expected. Something cold tightened briefly in her chest. After everything growing quietly between them over the past months, after the late-night meetings and silent coffee cups and the rooftop photographs and the way his attention always found her in crowded rooms, the sentence sounded dangerously close to distance. "To regret." Claire lowered her gaze toward the reports in front of her before answering carefully. "I understand." Alexander frowned slightly. "That is not what I meant." She looked back at him then. Really looked at him. His posture remained calm, but tension rested beneath it now. Controlled. Measured. "Board members are starting to question your influence over executive decisions," he continued quietly. "Political investors are watching every interaction between us." Claire folded her hands slowly together. Then perhaps they should not see any interactions at all. The silence that followed stretched painfully across the room. Alexander stepped closer to the conference table, his voice lowering slightly. "Claire." The way he said her name stopped her from looking away. "I am warning you because they will target you first." The words settled heavily between them. Not rejection. Protection. Claire felt the misunderstanding unravel quietly inside her chest, replaced by something even more dangerous. Relief. Before she could respond, Alexander opened one of the acquisition folders resting on the table and slid several documents toward her. "There is something else you need to see." Claire glanced down casually at first. Then her breath caught. "Whitmore Logistics Acquisition Review." Her fingers froze against the edge of the file. Daniel Whitmore's name appeared across the executive summary beneath projected market losses and restructuring recommendations. For several seconds, the conference room seemed to lose sound entirely except for rain striking the windows beyond the city lights. Claire stared silently at the pages while old memories surfaced with brutal clarity. The Langford Hotel ballroom. Crystal chandeliers. "You were never built for this world." Alexander watched her carefully but did not interrupt the silence. He understood immediately what the file had done to her. Claire closed the folder slowly. "When did this happen?" she asked quietly. 3 weeks ago, Alexander answered. "The acquisition became serious yesterday." Claire stood too quickly from her chair and moved toward the windows overlooking downtown Seattle, arms folded tightly against herself. Below them, headlights drifted through rain-covered streets like distant rivers of gold. She had spent an entire year rebuilding herself from the humiliation Daniel left behind. And now somehow fate had folded his name back into her life through the very company she helped build. Later that night, shortly after midnight, Claire finally left the building carrying the acquisition file against her chest. The underground parking garage echoed softly with rainfall dripping through distant concrete levels while security lights reflected against rows of black executive vehicles. Claire reached her car but stopped when footsteps approached behind her. Alexander. He crossed the garage slowly before holding out the acquisition folder she had accidentally left upstairs during the shock of the meeting. "You should hear it from me first," he said quietly. Claire looked at him for a long moment beneath the cold white garage lighting. Neither of them moved closer. Neither stepped away. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls, Thunder rolled softly across the city while the file containing Daniel Whitmore's future rested silently between them. Chicago greeted Claire Whitmore with cold wind and silver skies. The morning hail infrastructure arrived for the acquisition integration meetings. Nearly 1 year had passed since she walked out of the Langford Hotel through the service corridor carrying nothing except humiliation and silence inside her chest. Now the city looked different from 30 floors above downtown, where Hale Infrastructure occupied a temporary executive suite wrapped in glass and polished marble overlooking Lake Michigan. Snow drifted lightly across the skyline outside while assistants moved quickly through hallways carrying merger documents and financial summaries. Claire stood alone inside the executive conference room adjusting the sleeve of her ivory suit jacket before the board meeting began. Her reflection in the dark glass barely resembled the woman who once stood invisible beside Daniel Whitmore beneath ballroom chandeliers. She looked steadier now. Sharper somehow. Not because pain had disappeared. Because she had learned how to survive without explaining it to anyone. Across the room, executives from Hale Infrastructure prepared integration reports while legal advisors reviewed acquisition contracts in low voices. No one questioned Claire's presence anymore. They waited for her instructions before finalizing operational projections. Outside the conference room, Whitmore Logistics employees had already begun arriving floor by floor, unaware that the company they once considered untouchable officially belonged to Hale Infrastructure by noon. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the leather folder in front of her. Daniel Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer. The title looked smaller now than she remembered. Moments later, muffled voices echoed outside the conference room doors. Claire straightened instinctively. One of the legal advisors entered first, followed by several Whitmore Logistics executives wearing expressions strained by financial uncertainty. Daniel entered last. He looked older than she expected. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of exhaustion expensive suits could no longer fully hide. His gaze moved distractedly across the room while executives took their seats around the polished conference table. Then a voice near the doorway announced calmly, "Claire Whitmore will oversee integration personally." Daniel froze before he even turned. The room seemed to tighten around the silence that followed. Slowly, he looked toward the conference entrance. Claire stepped inside beside Alexander Hale. For one suspended moment, Daniel simply stared at her as though his mind could not reconcile the image in front of him with the woman he once dismissed so easily. Claire walked calmly toward the head of the conference table while executives rose automatically from their seats in acknowledgement. Alexander moved beside her without speaking, one hand resting loosely against the back of her chair before taking his own seat nearby. Daniel remained standing slightly too long. Shock moved visibly across his face before he forced himself back into professional composure. Claire noticed immediately how his eyes lingered on the executive identification screen displaying her name beside Hale Infrastructure leadership credentials. Not Claire Whitmore, wife of Daniel Whitmore. Claire Whitmore, Executive Director of National Operations Integration. The meeting began beneath cold white lighting and the distant sound of Chicago traffic moving below the tower windows. Claire spoke calmly through acquisition projections while digital reports illuminated the glass walls around them. Every sentence remained measured. Professional. Controlled. Yet Daniel barely seemed capable of focusing on the presentation itself. He watched her instead. The confidence in her voice. The way executives deferred naturally when she spoke. The complete absence of hesitation whenever she answered questions. Halfway through the meeting, Daniel finally interrupted. With respect, he said carefully, "Your projections underestimate the operational strain this transition will create internally." Claire looked toward him evenly across the table. Before she could answer, Alexander spoke first. "She built the system keeping this company alive." The room fell silent immediately. Not dramatic silence. Worse. Absolute silence. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Around the table, senior executives lowered their eyes toward their reports while legal advisors suddenly became very interested in their notes. Claire remained perfectly still beside the glowing projection screen, but something shifted quietly inside her chest at Alexander's words. Not because he defended her publicly. Because he said it with complete certainty. As if there had never been any question of her value at all. The meeting continued, but the balance inside the room had already changed permanently. Daniel spoke less after that. He listened instead. And the more he listened, the clearer the realization became across his face. Claire had not simply recovered after he broke her world apart. She had become powerful inside a world he could no longer control. When the integration meeting finally ended 2 hours later, executives gathered their files while assistants escorted teams toward separate conference floors. Snow drifted softly beyond the towering windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Claire closed her notebook quietly and stood from her chair. For a brief moment, tension rose near the far side of the room when 2 executives challenged one of the acquisition revisions. Instinctively, Claire's eyes shifted across the table searching for Alexander before she even realized she was doing it. He was already watching her. Calm. Steady. Present. The same silent reassurance he had given her from the beginning. Daniel noticed the exchange immediately. And somehow that realization seemed to affect him more deeply than the acquisition itself. Because for the first time since entering the room, he finally understood something irreversible. Claire no longer looked at him searching for approval. She had already found safety somewhere else. Boston glittered beneath fresh snowfall. The night Hale Infrastructure hosted its annual philanthropic gala inside the Astoria Grand overlooking the harbor. Crystal chandeliers washed the ballroom in gold light while orchestral music drifted softly above conversations between governors, investors, senators, and executives moving through the marble halls in black tuxedos and couture gowns. Outside the towering windows, snow moved slowly across the city skyline like ash falling through silence. Claire Whitmore stood near the edge of the ballroom in a silver satin gown that caught the light each time she turned beneath the chandeliers. Months earlier, she would have felt out of place inside rooms like this. Now the room adjusted around her presence instead. Political donors greeted her by name. Executives paused conversations when she approached. Somewhere between Seattle and Chicago, she had stopped trying to earn belonging. And somehow that made people offer it freely. Across the ballroom, Alexander Hale stood surrounded by transportation investors and government officials near the central staircase. Even from a distance, Claire could feel the quiet gravity surrounding him. Calm. Controlled. Untouchable to most people in the room. Yet every few minutes, his attention still returned instinctively toward her through the moving crowd. Claire lowered her champagne glass slightly when their eyes met again across the ballroom. Something had shifted between them after Chicago. Neither of them had spoken directly about it since. But silence itself had begun carrying too much meaning. Later that evening, while snow pressed softly against the tall harbor windows, Claire stepped onto the quieter upper balcony overlooking the ballroom floor below. Music echoed upward beneath the chandeliers while guests drifted like blurred shadows beneath the gold light. Alexander joined her several moments later without announcement. His dark overcoat rested loosely over one arm after hours of political conversations and investor negotiations. For a while neither spoke. The harbor lights reflected softly across the glass behind them while snow continued falling beyond the city skyline. Claire exhaled carefully into the cold air drifting through the balcony doors. "I do not know what this has become," she admitted quietly. Her voice barely rose above the distant orchestra below. Alexander studied her for several long seconds, his expression softer than usual beneath the pale winter light. "I do," he answered. The words settled heavily between them. Claire looked toward him slowly, her pulse tightening unexpectedly beneath the silence. For the first time since they met, it felt as though the space between them might finally break open into something impossible to ignore. Then footsteps interrupted the moment. A political donor approached Alexander with urgent questions regarding federal infrastructure funding, forcing the fragile silence apart before either of them moved closer to it. Claire stepped back instinctively while Alexander's attention shifted reluctantly toward the conversation, pulling him away. The unfinished words remained suspended painfully between them long after the interruption ended. An hour later, the ballroom had grown louder with music and champagne and expensive laughter echoing beneath crystal light. Claire moved carefully through the crowd toward one of the quieter side corridors near the harbor entrance when a familiar voice stopped her gently. Claire. Daniel Whitmore stood near the marble archway separating the ballroom from the private lounge corridor. He looked different from the man she remembered from the Langford Hotel. Less polished. More human somehow. The arrogance that once wrapped around him so effortlessly had worn thin beneath the past year. Claire remained still, waiting. Daniel glanced briefly toward the ballroom before speaking again. I owe you an apology. The words came quietly. Honestly. No performance. No attempt at charm. Snow reflected softly through the windows behind him while distant orchestra music filled the silence between them. I spent years convincing myself that your kindness meant weakness, he continued carefully. I did not understand what you were carrying for both of us. Claire listened without interrupting. Surprisingly, hearing the apology did not reopen old wounds. It only confirmed how far away they already felt. Across the ballroom, Alexander noticed them speaking almost immediately. He stood surrounded by political donors near the grand staircase, but his attention fixed toward Claire with unmistakable stillness. For the first time since she met him, uncertainty flickered briefly across his expression before disappearing again beneath composure. Claire saw it from across the room. That realization alone shifted something quietly inside her chest. Daniel lowered his gaze. I was too late, he admitted softly. Claire looked at him for a long moment beneath the gold chandelier light. Yes, she answered gently. Not cruelly. Just truthfully. A few minutes later, Claire stepped outside onto the snow-covered balcony overlooking Boston Harbor to escape the growing noise inside. Cold air wrapped instantly around her shoulders while harbor lights shimmered across dark water below. She folded her arms against the cold and closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady the strange ache building inside her chest after everything left unfinished tonight. The balcony doors opened softly behind her. Alexander stepped outside carrying his gloves in one hand. Snow settled lightly across the shoulders of his black coat while the distant orchestra echoed faintly behind him. Without speaking, he moved beside her and carefully wrapped the gloves around her freezing hands. The warmth surprised her immediately. Claire looked up slowly. Alexander's gaze remained fixed on her with the same impossible steadiness he had carried from the beginning. You never have to survive alone again, he said quietly. Claire opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Because somewhere between Chicago and Boston, between boardrooms and rain and silent coffee cups and years of loneliness, she had begun realizing something terrifying. She no longer knew how to imagine her life without him standing inside it. Washington, D.C., shimmered beneath fresh snowfall on the final night of the Federal Infrastructure Summit, where politicians, billionaires, and national executives gathered inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom beneath cascading crystal chandeliers and towering gold-trimmed columns. The city outside looked softened by winter, but inside the ballroom, power moved quietly through handshakes, whispered negotiations, and cameras flashing beneath warm amber light. Claire Whitmore stood near the center of the reception hall in a black velvet gown that reflected silver whenever she moved beneath the chandeliers. Around her, senators and transportation executives greeted her with effortless respect now, discussing expansion contracts and national logistics policy as though she had always belonged among them. Yet despite the attention surrounding her, Claire felt strangely calm. The need to prove herself had finally disappeared. Across the ballroom, Alexander Hale finished a private discussion with federal investors before his eyes found her again through the crowd, the same way they always did. Steady. Immediate. Certain. Claire felt it even before she looked toward him. The orchestra shifted softly into a slower arrangement while snow drifted beyond the towering ballroom windows overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. Somewhere near the grand staircase, journalists gathered around Alexander for photographs connected to Hale Infrastructure's latest federal partnership announcement. One reporter asked whether he intended to expand internationally next year. Alexander answered politely, but his attention remained elsewhere. On her. The realization still unsettled her sometimes. Not because it felt uncertain anymore. Because it no longer did. Later that evening, Claire stepped away from the ballroom toward the quieter marble corridor leading to the private hotel entrance. The noise of the summit faded behind her into distant music and muffled conversation. She needed a moment to breathe. The last year moved through her mind in fragments as she walked slowly beneath the soft golden wall lighting. Chicago. Seattle rain. Sleepless nights. Coffee cups left beside her while she slept. The rooftop in Boston. Alexander's gloves around her freezing hands. You never have to survive alone again. Claire. Daniel Whitmore's voice stopped her gently near the entrance corridor. She turned slowly. He stood alone beneath the marble archway wearing a dark overcoat over his suit, snow melting lightly against the shoulders. For several seconds neither spoke. Daniel looked tired in a way wealth could no longer disguise. Not broken. Just honest now. Finally he lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. I spent a long time believing success belonged only to people willing to harden themselves, he said quietly. You made everything look effortless. I mistook that for weakness. Claire listened silently while soft piano music drifted faintly from the ballroom behind them. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. I was wrong about you. Snow reflected through the glass entrance doors beside them while hotel staff moved quietly in the distance preparing black luxury cars outside. Claire looked at him calmly. The anger she once carried toward him had faded so completely that its absence almost surprised her. Daniel stepped closer carefully, his voice lower now. If I had understood your worth sooner. Claire interrupted softly before he could finish. Too late. The words were not cruel. They did not need to be. Because for the first time since their marriage ended, Claire no longer needed him to regret losing her. Daniel closed his eyes briefly and nodded once, accepting the truth inside her voice without argument. Then he stepped aside quietly and disappeared back toward the ballroom shadows. Claire remained near the entrance for another moment while snow drifted slowly beyond the glass doors outside. Behind her, the ballroom continued glowing with wealth and power and admiration. The same kind of world Daniel once claimed she was never built for. Yet now that world opened around her effortlessly. Not because she fought for its approval. Because she finally stopped believing she needed it. A few minutes later, Claire stepped outside into the cold Washington night. Snow covered the sidewalks in soft white silence while black executive vehicles lined the curb beneath glowing hotel lights. Across the street, reporters and political staff still moved between entrances carrying folders and cameras through the snowfall. Then Claire saw him. Alexander Hale stood beside a black town car waiting quietly beneath the falling snow. No assistants. No security nearby. Just him. He opened the passenger door the moment she approached, his eyes never leaving hers. For a second, Claire did not move. Then she noticed something resting carefully on the leather seat inside the car. Her old leather notebook. The one she lost the night they first met in Bellevue. The folded Chicago train ticket still tucked safely between its pages. Alexander had kept it the entire time. Claire looked back at him slowly, emotion tightening unexpectedly inside her chest. You kept it, she whispered. Snow settled softly into Alexander's dark hair while city lights reflected across the wet pavement around them. I kept everything that mattered, he answered quietly. The world seemed to fall silent around them after that. No cameras. No boardrooms. No investors. Only winter air and the man who had seen her value long before she learned how to see it herself. Claire stepped closer until only inches remained between them. Then gently, without hesitation, she reached for his hand. Alexander closed his fingers around hers immediately, steady and warm against the cold. For the first time in years, Claire did not feel like she was surviving anymore. She felt chosen. Behind them, the Grand Meridian Ballroom continued glowing gold against the snowy Washington night while the black town car waited beneath falling snow and city light. And as Alexander guided her gently toward the open door beside him, Claire realized something quietly extraordinary. She had not won him back. She had won herself. And this time, she was finally walking toward a future where nobody would ever make her feel worthless again.